And before we begin, I'd like us all to join an acknowledgement to country. So on behalf of myself and all the team members here at Halad today, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of our land in which we live and work, that being the Wurundjeri people for us here in Melbourne, but also acknowledge the Indigenous people from the land in which you might be joining us here today, whether that be on Australian soil or not, and I acknowledge the connection that they have with the land. And I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and future, and emerging. So thank you so much for joining me in that acknowledgement of country. And as you'll see further down in this master workshop, the importance of really acknowledging the Indigenous culture here in our country. So welcome to our Med Interviews Master Skills Workshop. It's generally just a really exciting but also anxious time for the sort of coming cohort, getting sort of the Med Interview offers and waiting for all of that to come out. But also props to you guys, because you're probably the first cohort to go through this process through a pandemic. So truly, well done to you guys for coming and investing your time and investing in yourself to really still stick to it whilst all this is happening around us. So first things first, if you have not heard of us before, or if you're not from Melbourne, you might not have heard of us, but we are not a GAMSAT or Med Interview company. We are very much a non-for-profit that runs Australia's most affordable GAMSAT and Med Interview tuition services that really does make a social impact, where all of the proceeds from our tuition fees go towards our social impact mission over in the Philippines, where we take a bunch of Australian university students to go over and volunteer for 2 weeks in some of our partner communities, and they'll go and teach some really important health topics to some of the most disadvantaged schools and communities in that area. And as you can see, Gabby is one of the students who've been on that trip and has been able to teach thousands of students during her mission. And it's just crazy for us to see now that for every GAMSAT and Med Interview cohort that comes through our program, it's amazing that we're able to raise about 10 grand in funds for that social impact cause. So thank you so much for everyone who has come along to this and also contributed to that cause, because it really does mean a lot. And especially, and I always say this, that it's those people who help in those early days and support us in those early days who do make a world of difference in setting up the foundations for where we'll get to. So that's you guys for us today. And so thank you so much for joining us in that. Second things second, we always love open sourcing and doing all of these events. And the reason why is truly we just want to see you guys succeed. There is truly just nothing better and nothing more satisfying than seeing our students be able to share messages of how well they've improved and how well they've done. And we very much look forward to that happening with you guys in your interviews. And I know Pravind is in here, so I'll rave about Pravind, but we absolutely love seeing messages of just how much you guys have improved, and there's nothing more satisfying for our tutors. Our MD team who are running the sort of Med Interview MMIs here today, they have all been in your shoes, 1, 2, 3 years ago. So it's so fresh to them knowing exactly how much this point in time and this opportunity that you have means to you, because they were in your shoes, not so long ago. So we would just, truly just want to see you guys succeed. So make the most and milk the most out of the time that you have with our team. We're almost all hands on deck today with all of our tutors and all of our sort of examiners, not because they have nothing better to do on a Saturday morning, but because they truly just want to help and see you guys improve. So I'll quickly, briefly introduce everyone now at the very beginning, because I just don't want to stop halfway through when everyone sort of comes on and you guys start doing your live MMIs, and then sort of the flow gets interrupted. So if you have not met me yet, I'm Eliza. I'm the co-founder and managing director here at Halad, which basically means I have nothing to do with the actual content of what you're going to learn in a bit. So I probably am not the best person to ask questions to, but if you have any questions about our programs or whatnot, feel free to chuck them in the chat and I'll answer them immediately. Sarah, who is our head of GAMSAT and also an MD3 at Monash. She's interviewed at Monash and Melbourne. We have Gabby, who's also interviewed at Monash, Melbourne, and I want to say UCID. And we have Karim, who's also at Melbourne Uni, interviewed at Monash and Melbourne. Mish, who's also at Melbourne Uni, interviewed at UCID, Melbourne, and Monash. Then we have Tom, who's currently at Notre Dame, Keely, who's also at Melbourne, and then Matt, who's at Deakin. So we try to pull a lot of different sort of interview experiences to today so that we could cover as a diverse range of universities as we see that you guys are applying to. So hopefully you guys get to learn something from the experiences that all of the examiners have had. And in the last hour, you'll get to do 2 live MMIs in sort of a group, and you'll be going to 2 different examiners' stations so that you get a bit of a different view. So before we start, I just wanted to give everyone a rundown of sort of the philosophy that we have behind being able to help people when they're going through their med interviews. And our big thing is truly authenticity, that we're never going to teach you exactly what to say, because what you're going to say is your story, your truth, and your opinion. So we're never going to take that away from you, but we're just going to help you structure how to say it, because there is definitely a way to effectively communicate something in 8 minutes and an ineffective way to communicate something. So as much as med interviews matter, being authentically you in those med interviews matters more. And I hope that you take that through to the next hour as you start doing the practice and start beginning doing that live. So a rundown of today, we're very much split today into 3 parts. Sarah will run the first part of sort of just everything you need to know as a big high-level overview of the med interviews and sort of what they look like across different unis. Then Sarah and Gabby will do a group response to 2 live MMI stations, and that will be via the poll function, so participate in that through the poll. And then we're going to go into the last hour where it's very much the live MMIs, and people will give real feedback, real time to your responses. And so we'll go into breakout rooms, and so you'll be assigned to a certain breakout room with one examiner, and then in the next one you'll switch to a different breakout room. So just bear with us if the breakout rooms just take a bit of time to swap over between those 2. And in that live MMI part, we really do encourage that, you give feedback to your own peers as well in that room, as well as sort of the examiner doing that, because that really does help students who are giving it a good crack. So we're always happy to open source these events for you guys, and we love doing it. But in this case, I just have 2 asks for everyone moving forward before I hand over. The first ask is just get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And what this means is sort of, for the students who are going to be responding live in front of a group of essentially just understanding that I think people who will consciously put themselves in those uncomfortable situations and put their hand up to really take that leap of faith and do that in front of strangers are the ones who are going to grow through this. And we want you guys all to be able to grow and learn something and improve by the end of this session. So please do, when the opportunity does arise for you to share, please just take the time to realize that being uncomfortable is good in this situation, and this is a safe space to do that. And the second is, please speak to others how you would like to be spoken to. And I think I'm especially talking to when I'm offering feedback to your peers, to think that, there's always a kind of more constructive way to offer feedback. And I'm not saying here be nice, because, I think what your peers and what you would want is constructive, productive feedback rather than a string of things that are nice so that, that you don't offend people's feelings. So there are ways to say productive things, but in a kind way. So just before you offer some feedback, maybe just replay that in your head and just think, would I like my feedback to be delivered that way? And that is a great sort of check before going forward. And so with those 2 asks, I hope that you guys do enjoy the next 2 hours of real content going through, and I'll hand over to Sarah.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. All right. I am very excited to be with you all this morning. I'm a bit tired, so if I yawn, I'm really sorry. It's not because I'm bored of any of you. I'm actually very grateful that you all chose to spend your Saturday here with us. So like Eliza said, the next sort of half hour, 45 minutes will be a little bit more didactic, or I guess I'll go through some things that I think are quite pertinent and set you guys up. And then it will be over to all of you, and you'll get a chance to put in some responses and get some live practice and some live feedback. So I'll give you a little bit more on the logistics of that later, but hold tight for now. And I'm just going to run you through some MMI stuff. Also, if at any point you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to answer them as they come through or at some point. But yes, you're always welcome to ask questions. So I just wanted to set you all up first. And if you've been to any of my GAMSAT webinars, masterclasses, even some of my lessons, you've probably seen this slide before, but I think it's something that is easy for people to forget. And that is that the key purpose of these med entry, I guess, checkpoints or programs is to make sure that they're picking people who are genuine and that they're picking the right people. And I'm sure you're all thinking, sadly, that you know a couple of people who have made it into med school or who are doctors who are perhaps a little robotic or maybe not as empathetic as they could be. And it might feel like, oh, well, you know, they've just, you can rote learn your way in, or you can sort of get through by learning your way in. And yes, I do think that there's a possibility of that. I won't deny that. But if you would like to be a stellar healthcare professional and bring yourself to the table, this checkpoint of MMIs is really about showing yourself and bringing yourself to the day, no matter how nervous you are, and letting the markers see that you are real. And so that is really what's going in through the heads of the markers when you walk into your MMI station. Well, I guess you're not going to be walking in this year, but when you arrive, is that you are real. And so I really like this slide because everyone hates having to do the recapture, but I think it's a nice reminder. So, and I guess on that note, I think that there's a misconception sometimes of what healthcare professionals or budding healthcare professionals think that patients want versus what they actually want. And this is something that I've seen a lot, even on placement, is that we think that patients essentially want perfection. And so they want someone who's super smart, who always gets it correct, and who knows exactly how to fix them straight away, which isn't exactly true. Yes, patients would love these things, but if they only wanted these things, then they would hire AI, or they would use the countless number of resources online to help them with their diagnosis and treatment, and they wouldn't need us at all. So it's really important to keep in mind that they're not looking in these interviews for someone who's perfect or who's the smartest person in the world. And that should give you a lot of comfort because it lowers that expectation of things. I'd also say that if they're getting your GPA and you've done if you've done an undergrad degree, then they already know that you're smart. So that's not what they're looking for in the interviews. They're looking for other skills. And so the things that the patients really want, on top of you being able to diagnose and treat them, is someone who's able to listen and understand what's going on and understand that they are going through one of the hardest times in their life, many of them. Many people don't plan on getting sick. Many people are in very vulnerable circumstances when they are. And you are so lucky to be one of the people who is trusted to be there when that happens. And so you need to show that you're that kind of person who can be there and show up when they need it most. So being able to show those soft skills is something that is really tested in these interviews. And so I really like this slide. I think of those old balances where you have to sort of weigh up two really important things. And so one of them is definitely that intelligence and that ability to clinically reason and use your scientific knowledge and the things that you will learn as you're developing as a healthcare professional. But the other side of it is definitely the humanness and the ability to be emotive and empathetic. These parts I really think do have equal weighting and balance out, and this is what makes a fantastic healthcare professional, which is really the edge and is what they're looking for in your MMIs. And so I really love this slide. I am obsessed with Disney, and Frozen is one of my favorites. So how convenient that in Frozen 2 there is a song called Show Yourself. If you haven't seen it, small plug, love Frozen 2, it's amazing. But more importantly for today, I think about interviews. One of the things that I always tell myself is, what are 2 to 3 things if I walked out of this interview, I would be really disappointed that they didn't know about me. And I think that that holds true for MMIs. And it doesn't mean, oh, I love dogs, I hope that they know I love dogs when I leave. It's more, what are some key things about myself that if I walk out, they miss the point. So if I'm a really kind person, I want people to get the impression that I'm kind. And if they haven't gotten that, then I haven't delivered myself correctly. So while you're practicing, and I'm going to give you some tips on how to practice today, really think about what are those things about me that I want to show. And you're able to show them in a myriad of ways. So find what ways work for you as well. You can show them in the ways that you express your opinions and beliefs. Some stations will be conducive to you sharing personal experiences or drawing upon those experiences. And some of them you'll even be encouraged to share some of your passions and interests. I like to tell my students the phrase, everyone has a story to tell, because I really believe that's true. And by the time of your life that you are coming to enter medical school, I'm sure you already have a story or part of a story that you can tell. And so I think that it's really important not to shy away from being who you are and letting yourself shine and letting yourself show. So I've put together some do's and don'ts because I think some of these things are overlooked. There are obviously much more do's and don'ts than this, but some of them are quite self-explanatory. So I tried to leave those ones out, and I called them yays and nays because I think I'm funny sometimes. But with the yays, I would say definitely what we were just saying about showing who you are and proving that you have the qualities of a doctor or of a good doctor. And so I would encourage brainstorming what some of those qualities would be and what ones you particularly think you have. And that could probably be one or two of those things that you're like, I really want to show this part of me in my interview. It's okay to be passionate. In fact, you should be passionate. And if you come to a topic, just a quick question in the chat about whether this recording will be available. Yes, and we'll send it out to you afterwards, a link. Yeah. And yeah, so if you have 2 to 3 things that you go, you know what, I think I want to show these things, this would probably be one of those. Yes, in terms of passion, there will be some stations that you see and you go, yes, I love this topic, or this really resonates with me. Gabby, who will talk a bit about Indigenous health later for one of her stations, that's something she's really passionate about, and she can show how that can shine through when you're answering your station. So you definitely are not encouraged to come in and be robotic and be stone-faced and say, yes, what a great topic, I'm going to tell you about it. You can bring yourself to the table in terms of what you're interested in. In terms of the nays, there are some words and phrases which really aren't appropriate. The obvious ones are things like swearing, but the less obvious ones are things that might be culturally insensitive or maybe something that's inherently racist. So just make sure that you think about what kinds of phrases and words you might accidentally say and practice sort of censoring those out. It's really not the place to make light jokes about minority groups. So just thinking about things like that. With that, also overly controversial opinions, you are more than welcome to give your opinion. But if your opinion is something that seems very controversial in light or in the scope of being a healthcare professional, it's probably not appropriate to say, or you'll need to learn a way to phrase your opinion in a very careful and tactful way. So think about that. If you're not sure if an opinion seems overly controversial, then have a think about it. Maybe ask a friend or someone you trust, or you can ask a tutor or someone else, is this something that would be appropriate to say? So have a think about that. And if you have any strong opinions, I'm not really someone who's overly strongly opinionated, but I know a lot of people and a lot of my friends are, and that was something they had to be really careful of. This one's a really big point. I think there are a lot of misconceptions around it. And if you've come to any of my sessions before, you've also heard me say this, but I've never met a doctor in my life that I've gone, wow, they're such a good doctor because they're so eloquent. That's just not a thing. So I don't want anyone stressing that, oh, I didn't sound like a narrator or a news reporter. That is not the point of this activity. It is to see who you are and to see how you think. It's not to see if you can perfectly perform. So if you're a little bit nervous, a little bit shaky, that's okay. It just shows that you care about it. Obviously, it would be ideal to walk away and be like, yeah, I looked confident and I looked like I was in control. But if you are using simple language and conveying your thoughts, it's fine. It's fine to be a little bit nervous, and they completely understand. The marker's not sitting there going, well, her voice shaked. No. So completely fine. Don't want anyone worrying about this part. It will naturally become a bit better as you practice, but if it's still there on the day, perfectly fine. In terms of this one, I see this a lot when maybe it's a nerves thing, maybe it's also just getting excited to answer the topic. Take a little bit of time to think about what you think and what you'd like to express rather than just word vomit. Because most of the time when the word vomit happens, the thing that you actually wanted to say gets hidden or doesn't actually get to come out. And the last one, I think this one's not so much a hard nay, but I just wanted to clarify redundant lines, which I don't know why so many people keep teaching that this is a good idea and a good idea in interviews. When the interviewer asks you a question, there is no need to say, yeah, wow, great question, or oh, I hadn't thought of that, or wow, how interesting. That is just not necessary. Way more appropriate for you to bring your style and bring your own way of conversing with the interviewer and having an interesting discussion, rather than saying these redundant, very overused, overworked lines that you've clearly been taught. So definitely don't just be a robot and go, okay, now I will answer your question. But definitely no need to learn or memorize a phrase to say. They can pick it out like a sore thumb and it's just wasting your time. So those are some yays and nays to set us up. In terms of the actual, so I'm going to go over some of the skills, I guess, for an MMI station. So most of you will be given the exact breakdowns of the stations depending on where you are doing your MMIs. So the timing does vary slightly, but let's say that you have 2 minutes to read the scenario and 5 to 8 minutes to complete the station just for today's benefit. I'm going to go over a little bit about what to do in those 2 minutes while you read that scenario, how to structure your response in the station, and just to get you going once you leave today, some of the things that you can go over in your own time and learn about to help you with idea generation in your stations. And then I'll hand it over to actually getting some practice in. So when you see the scenario, I think 2 things can happen. 1, you can blank out, or 2, you can have this racing mind. So I guess not only 2 things can happen, but 2 big sort of negative or distracting things can happen. And both of those can feel really distressing at the time. So if you find that you're not naturally someone who grasps the scenario and goes, yep, I'm good, I found it really helpful to ask myself 2 key questions. So I'd read the scenario, and let's say that it was about euthanasia. I would go, okay, what do I naturally think about this topic? What is my first instinctive, what do I think about this? And then another great one is, do I have any connection to this? So is there something relevant in my life, in my values, in my experiences that helps me to connect with this topic? And then going in, you already have this springboard to come off of so that you feel like you can center your thoughts and center your understanding. Also having an approach, I'm going to go over this a little bit more, but having an approach when, even from the point when you start reading that scenario, should be happening outside the door or outside the room on your Zoom interview, regardless of what kind of station it is, but this may vary depending on the station. So if the station looks like an overly personalized one, you'd probably be thinking more about personal experiences, whereas if it looks like an ethical one, probably be thinking more about that. So I get a lot of questions about what's the best way to structure my response? What's the best way to give an answer? And there are a lot of people out there who will tell you that there's one way, and that's just simply not true. There are plenty of ways. Your job is to practice and find one that works for you. And anyone who tells you that you're doing it the wrong way probably isn't the right person to be getting like MMI practice advice from. So the methods that you can use are highly varied and can be personalized, and they can also depend on the station type. So I'm going to show you a couple of methods, and then I want you to go away and practice some and see what works for you. So one of them is the STAR method. I'm not going to spend a lot of time telling you about this because you can look it up online. It's a really common interview style method, and you can look up tons and tons of ways to do it, but basically breaking it down into the situation, the task or what's being asked of you, an action, so something that you would physically carry out or something that you conclude, and then what would be the result of that or what would be the follow-up. So that's a really common method that you can use, especially quite good for ethical stations or stations when you are asked to make a decision. Another one is a spoken essay. This is one a lot of people gravitate towards because it's familiar. So you can say, okay, I have 2 to 3 points about this, or maybe when you get asked a question, you say, this is my key point about this, and then provide a summarizing statement or a summary conclusion. Some stations will ask you to address pros and cons and show both sides. Other people just like to show the pros and cons and weigh up each side. Another way to do that is the if then. So you can say, if this was to happen, then this would be the result. But if this was to happen, then this would be the result. This one I like for questions where you have to consider a lot of elements or consider a lot of parties. So sort of your 5Ws. So who was involved, what's going on. And when you have each of these, you can break them down. So who was involved? Okay, am I involved? Is a professional involved? Is a patient involved? Is a stakeholder involved, like a healthcare service? And what involvement do they have, or what role do they have, and what decisions do I make in this station that affect those people? And go through that the same way. What is it about when it's happening that's critical? Is it happening in the ED in the middle of the night when there's no access to resources versus when it's in the middle of the day and the specialist is there to refer? So there are a lot of whens, wheres, whys, who, whats that are really pertinent in medicine. And so even if your station has nothing to do with the medical field, considering these kinds of elements can help you to show that you can get into that mindset. And then this model I also like. It's a more zoom in model. So starting out from like a broader lens, so maybe a global, international or national perspective, and then starting to zoom in and go, how does this affect things on the local level, or what are some of sort of the closer to home things or people that are affected by this scenario? And then personally, how does this affect me and what link does this have to me and my experiences? So I guess what I wanted to show you was structure is important. Being scrambled is not a very helpful way for you to approach a scenario, but saying that there is no one way to structure it. So it will depend a little bit on the station type. It will also depend on you and how you express yourself. So just a few key points about that. I'm sure you guys all picked up that in the structures I showed you before, there are a lot of points for you, or a lot of time points where you can make conclusive statements or when you have to come to a decision. So something really important there, people think that it's a great idea in an interview not to show what you genuinely think or not to make a conclusive decision. And I think that this is something to be aware of, that they're not expecting you to walk out and go, you could do this or you could do that. Okay, cool, I'm done. Doctors are not fence sitters. If doctors were fence sitters, patients would never get seen or treated or diagnosed. So make a decision and explain why you chose that decision. The stations are not designed to have a correct answer. And so be confident enough to show that you can make a decision, even if you're not sure if you're correct. And you can explain that and say, I'm not 100% sure if this would work, but I'd rather give it a try than not give it a try. So if there is a station that asks you to make a decision, don't be a fence sitter just because you're trying to be diplomatic. That's not what doctors do. That's what politicians do. Another thing is that if you don't really feel confident to make a decision, you can say, you know what, I don't think I have the resources or the knowledge to make this decision right now, but what would help me to decide would be this factor, or would be knowing this, or would be if someone helped me with this. So you can sit on the fence if you show your way off the fence. So this won't be applicable to every scenario. It's not like every scenario you have to make a cold, hard and fast decision. But if it is a decision-making one, there are no brownie points for the people who try to be diplomatic. That's not the point of an MMI. No need to be a robot. I think we've already discussed that enough. Don't ramble, answer the question, move on. I know it can be a nervousness thing, but no need to keep reiterating what you're saying. The examiners are highly trained, so they'll pick up on the things that you say and notice those things that are important. Feel free to ask the examiner for clarifications. I like to think of it more as a discussion than a full-blown interview, because they will ask you questions as well. I think it's in all MMIs, but if your MMI package says that they won't ask you questions, then ignore this point. But the ones that I both did, they asked me questions throughout the station. So it became a bit more like a chat, and it was this very much professional but still personable approach. So I still was professional and maintained those aspects, but definitely was connecting and engaging with them. So something that I really like that Gabby, our tutor, shared in one of our webinars was that practice makes perfect. But not only does practice make perfect, perfect practice makes perfect. And I think the word here, perfect, doesn't mean you being flawless. It means making sure that your practice is consistent and is appropriate and is the right practice, rather than just sloppily practicing or practicing and reinforcing the same mistakes. So if you're going to practice, do it well. So this is probably something that you guys can access online in a myriad of ways. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this slide, but this is just a breakdown of some of the scenarios that you could get shown. And obviously they're not going to give you a scenario that says, this scenario is about public health, discuss public health, but there'll be a scenario that addresses public health in some way. So I think becoming familiar with these umbrella stations and coming familiar with some aspects of these topics would set you up well. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about memorizing in a second, but before I do that, I wanted to go over a little bit of idea generation because I know that this, oh, my clicker's not working, sorry. I know that this can be a little bit overwhelming, can look a bit overwhelming. So I wanted to put this together to help get you guys started when you leave today. So I've put the scenarios together over 2 slides. And what I will do is just briefly tell you some of the things you can do to help you prepare for different kinds of stations. And then after this, I'll tell you some ways that you can effectively practice. So the YMed station, I'm going to go over that in a little bit more detail soon. Needed to sneeze. Okay, we're good. So there'll be more on this one coming. Health inequity is a super popular one for them to ask about, especially if the medical school you're applying for is in a rural or Indigenous community or has a lot of placements in those communities. They'll have more of an emphasis on it. So just be aware of where the medical schools are that you're applying for. And so things that I would learn about in terms of health inequity would be resource allocation and allocation when there are inequities, compensating medical professionals to get them to work in these kinds of communities and what you think about that, what you think appropriate compensations could be, how we can appeal to medical students to work in these kinds of communities and help with these inequities, and what things you think might be good solutions for when you notice inequity and when you notice that healthcare isn't being fairly distributed. In terms of public health, this one does also involve inequity, and these two could definitely be a station that is fused together. But other elements of public health I would find out about would be what happens when communities don't have good health education or literacy, or what difference does it make when they do, and maybe some examples you can think of. Also, whether you think what you think about money being spent in preventive health versus reactive health, and maybe examples you can think of that, and examples of where public health efforts have been effective and when they have not. So stations on all of these, just as a little FYI, can be very niche and are not designed for you to regurgitate facts that you have learned. So just to be really clear, going away and looking up ideas is not so that you can memorize facts. It's just to help you to become oriented and comfortable with different kinds of topics. In terms of ethics, I find ethics can be split across both medical and general, but they can also be fused in the one station. And so ethical things, I would look up what are some medical sticking points or ethical sticking points in the medical field. There are so many of them. Probably look them up and more think about, how do I approach these in my mind, and am I approaching them effectively, reasonably, etc. So things like euthanasia, abortion, consent and confidentiality, resource allocation, they're a great start. There's heaps online, and you can start practicing talking through some of these stickier and trickier topics. Things like what values are important to me and what values are important in the situation, because those are the things you're going to be expressing regardless of the scenario you get given on the day. And what kind of patient support services are there for the patient in an ethical dilemma, and what support and advice services would I need as a healthcare professional as well. So maybe you're talking about euthanasia, you'd probably also need to be talking about your mental well-being and about what support services you'd need. So there's a lot of things involved in discussing ethics, and we're going to have a little bit of practice of that today as well for you guys. With that as well, in more general ethics, it's more that they might give you a more everyday scenario and see, what do you think about how we treat other people and deal with everyday situations, and just standing up for the things that you believe in. So my idea for all of you in terms of this slide is that this should be a little bit of stimulus if you aren't sure how to start thinking about things or start looking for content to prepare for MMIs, to go away and practice on some of these key points, rather than this being a slide that you need to memorize. Similarly, there are stations that are probably a little bit more skill-based rather than opinion-based. And so you can get stations that get you to explain something or give instruction. My tip for this would be to practice explaining certain concepts. The best way that I find to do this is I pick a random topic. It could literally be anything. And I practice explaining it for 5 minutes. And I like to think, can I explain this to a child? If I explained it to a child the way I just did, would they understand me? And I think knowing that in all of these skills-based stations, knowing it's okay to get it wrong, or even that there is no right or wrong. So give it a go. And if you don't feel like you came off as finessed or that you showed the right angle, there is no real right or wrong. It's about, can you communicate well and can you achieve the goal? So in this case, the goal is, can you explain something effectively? Whereas this one, the goal is not, can you get the right answer in solving a problem? It's, can you think logically through a problem? So also I would do the same activity as this. I'd practice a problem solving task. With this one, with the actor stations, I always got really scared about these because I thought I had to be like a good actor, and that's something I'm not comfortable with, and it makes me feel embarrassed. But that's not the design of this station. The design is to see, how do you respond to people in real time and in real scenarios. So it's all good and well to say, I think I'm a really empathetic person, or I would care about the patient like this, but it's really giving you a chance to show, how do you actually care about people when push comes to shove, or how do you do things in a sensitive way. So it could be something like having to give bad news or having to give difficult advice. Maybe it's having to give feedback that's really uncomfortable to give. So these sorts of difficult scenarios where you have to interact with someone in an uncomfortable or challenging way, the idea of this station is to see that humanness and to see, can you show the correct emotions? It's not, am I a brilliant actor and can I show that I'm able to stay in character? If that was the case, I definitely would have failed at this, and also fail at many activities in medical school where you have to practice speaking to patients. So that's not the point of the station. And I would say all of these, you can definitely practice them with friends and family, even people who aren't sitting MMIs. So that leads me on to, how do I actually practice? And I would say, firstly, use those slides I just showed you, plus other things you find online, other resources you might have, to brainstorm possible topics and scenarios that they might ask you under the umbrella of each sort of station type, and come up with some questions to go with those. When I was preparing, I just put them all in a hat and I pulled one out, and I would give myself the time for the interview that I had. I think it was 8 minutes. I would give myself 8 minutes to respond. If you really want to do it blinded, or if you are able to, I would encourage doing it blinded. So doing it with a friend who's also doing MMIs, and they can find you stations, you can find them stations, or you can practice with a family member, someone you know who's already in med. I think it's good to get feedback from a couple of different people, which is not them saying you should have talked about this or you should have told me that. It's about saying, you know, how did you present it? How did you respond? What impression did I get from you from practicing the station? So just to be clear, when you practice, it's not about, did you memorize a well finished answer? It's about, did you bring yourself to the table and share things that showed who you are? And the last thing is just to always reflect. This is something that I teach a lot, is reflective practice and reflective preparation. And this is a huge component of being a healthcare professional. So you might as well start now. So asking yourself after the station, what did I do well? What can I change or improve? And is there anything that any gaps I need to fill? So anything else I need to learn or know about this topic? And I think this is so important, because what people do is they practice and they go, well, that was great practice. And then they close their books and they walk away, and then they come back a couple of days later and they make the same mistakes. So make sure that you're reflecting in a way that works for you. And finally, just a little note on memorizing. I've pretty much already mentioned this today, but definitely practicing is not a chance for you to rote memorize. Most of the stations you get, you won't be able to preempt fully anyway, but even if you can, the markers can tell if you've just rote memorized a beautifully polished answer. It's much better for you to do things more ad lib based on the ways that you've practiced beforehand. And it also doesn't help you in the long run, because when you're a healthcare professional, when you're a doctor, you're not going to have the time to memorize a response to anything. So what we won't be doing today, when you guys get some practice, is telling you what to say. There's definitely no right answer to these scenarios. There are some wrong things you can say, but the main thing is that you learn how to be yourself. So what we will do today is focus on guiding you on forming your own opinions and responses to the scenarios, to give you some feedback, some tips, some advice, and just give you some exposure to some practice, especially if that's something you haven't gotten a lot of. So just so we're all clear on expectations of today. So just how it's going to run, we're going to have 4 stations. I think Eliza went over this at the start anyway, but just in case you came in a little bit later and missed that part, the first 2 stations will be on Poll EV. I'll give you the link in a minute, and it will be your short answer, and then I will run you through one of them and Gabby will run you through one of them. And then the second or the last 2 will put you in breakout rooms so you can get a little bit more of an interactive live experience. Just in terms of that, if you're a little bit more shy or not feeling up to it, that's okay. I think it will end up that there are about 7 to 8 people in your breakout room, but be prepared to volunteer. You will get the most out of it. It's so fine if you say something that you're like, I wish I hadn't said that. It's a safe place. We're not going to get mad at you, and we're not going to record the part where you're all in your breakout rooms, except for one of the rooms, and you can be very brave and get recorded. If not, we'll like block out your face or I can fill it in. So don't be worried about that. It really is an opportunity to get some feedback, some live feedback from one of our tutors, and get peer feedback, and just to see where you're at. If you can, turn on your camera. It makes it more interactive. If you want to wait till breakout rooms to do that, that's fine. And it helps us to actually see that you're there. So let's get started. So this is a really classic station. I'm going to tell you a bit more about it after you answer the question, but I'd like you all to jump onto the poll and write a response to this question of, why do you want to be a doctor? So I'm just going to change my screen share now to make sure the poll is live. Yeah, great question. While I make the poll live, I'll answer the question in the chat, which is, should I reiterate what the question is to the examiner or the interviewer? So if the question is integrated into the scenario in the one that you read, and you go into the interview and the examiner's just sitting there waiting for you to start, it might be a good segue for you to go, okay, so this is set the scene, this is what it is. But if the interviewer asks you the question outright, it's not really necessary to go, yes, so the question was this, or reword the question. It's not really necessary. So unless that's comfortably your style of answering questions, not a necessary thing to do. Probably one of more of those filler things. All right, I'll give you all a couple of minutes to actually get a chance to put in an answer. All right, amazing. Keep them coming in. I'm just going to answer one of the questions in the chat from Pravind, which is, would we be expecting interviews to move online given the pandemic and the uncertainties of state restrictions? So there are some universities who've already put up on their websites that it will be online. So check the ones that you're wanting to apply for, see if it's already up. There are a couple I know who have opted for it to be online. Others have not made a decision yet, and so it will be very much a watch this space. My unprofessional opinion in terms of this is that given the current climate, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to run MMIs in physical form. So I wouldn't get too excited about being able to do them in person. But I also wouldn't rule it out, because who knows, they might go, it's essential to have everyone there. But there are unis who've already decided that it will be online. Okay, so keep them coming in. I'm going to come back to everyone's slide and responses, and I'll even pick some out. Here. So just to give you all a little bit of context around this station. Oh, my clicker's not working yet. Okay. So like I mentioned, everyone has a story to tell, and that is probably the most pertinent to this kind of station. Now, in my interviews, I actually didn't get asked this station at all, but I was still prepared for it. And I think it's so important that you are, because regardless of whether you get asked it on the day or not, you need to know why you're rocking up to the party. So why do you want to do medicine? If you don't know the answer to this question, you probably need to work it out, because on those hard days when you're in medical school, when you're a doctor, you need to know why you're there. And so regardless of whether you get asked this in an interview, it's not a waste of time to work this out. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, tell you a bit about how I would structure it in an interview, or depending on different interviews, and then we'll come back to some of the responses you guys gave. So a little bit about me. this is the only picture I could find this week of me as a young kid, and I looked much cuter then than I do now, but that's okay. And I think the reason why this is so important to me was this was a really pivotal part of my lifetime. And so this won't be the case for everyone, but for me, when I was little, I always knew that I wanted to be a doctor. And so I was 3 years old. My dad was teaching me how to read, and he showed me a book with different professions in it. There was like firefighter, ballerina, etc. And he opened to the doctor page, and I said, "Dad, that's going to be me." And he was like, "Yeah, that's great." And I don't think he thought I was the brightest kid. And so he was like, "Yeah, that's nice. All right. Hopefully she thinks of something else and she moves on." But I didn't. And the reason why was because of this. So I grew up in a remote community of Australia. I grew up in Broken Hill, and it's not a smaller population as usually in rural Australia. It was a little bit of a rural epicenter, but not as much as what we actually needed, especially at the time. In fact, the closest rural epicenter was Mildura, which is a 3.5 hour drive away. And even that didn't have the healthcare we needed. And so this became a big problem when my mum was pregnant with my brother. So I was 4, and my mum died temporarily, and my mum was very sick. She was bedbound during most of the pregnancy, and my brother was very premature. And so we were in Broken Hill, and suddenly they were trying to rely on these healthcare professionals who simply were not there. And so thankfully, Broken Hill is actually the founding location of the Royal Flying Doctors Service, and the Royal Flying Doctors were able to get her to Adelaide in time, which for context is a 6-hour drive away. And so if it hadn't been for them being able to access healthcare quickly for my family, my mum and my brother wouldn't be here. And so that was really pivotal to me because I was young, and I don't really remember most of the experience, but I remember ever since then, I said that I wanted to help save people's lives because they saved my family. And so that was really important to me because it showed me that in these kinds of communities, healthcare should not be something that is just thrown away because you're far away. And I remember a lot of experiences as a kid, and something that happened to me was having to drive 6 hours just to get an MRI. And so these sort of experiences were really pivotal to me realizing that I wanted to help close this gap of health inequity. And then something else happened. I was a lot older. So between the ages of 17 and 22, I became really sick. And so it was my turn to have a little bit of a health battle. So this is me looking happy in hospital, but I definitely wasn't. In fact, this wheelchair in the corner here, which I tried to include in the picture, was the only thing I could use to move around. And this experience taught me that being sick, being disabled is not fun. It's very glamorized sometimes in the media, but when people become sick, they are in some of their most vulnerable circumstances of their lives. And I was very lucky because now I can walk, I can move around, but some of the patients that you have will be disabled for life, and their lives will change permanently because of their illnesses. And so I really learned from that the things I wanted to do was work with young people whose lives are changed through their health and teach them that they are able to overcome hard things. And I really wanted to be at the forefront of that and be that person who tells them, you know what, I know this is hard. I know this sucks, but you're going to be okay. And I'll support you through this regardless of what the outcome is. So I was lucky that I can walk and I can live and do many things. Some people may not. And I really wanted to advocate for those people, especially people who are in these disadvantaged settings. So that's a little bit about my story. But the reason why I wanted to tell you my story was not just so that you guys can all learn my life story, but because to show you that it's so important to understand the pivotal experiences in your life that helped you to realize that medicine was for you, but not just to blurt out these experiences. I know that I just did a little bit of that to give you context, but to selectively talk about the experiences in the context of what you get asked in the station. So if you get asked what key components of healthcare are you passionate about? Maybe I would talk about rural health and why I was passionate about that and draw on my experience there. Or maybe I would talk about disability and about how people aren't advocated for enough and that they need healthcare that extends far beyond just being given a diagnosis and a treatment. And so the marker is looking for something genuine. They're not looking for, I always wanted to be a doctor, or, oh, I just want to help people, that's a great start, but it's not going to cut it. And it's what everyone says. If you didn't want to be a doctor and you didn't want to help people, go and find a different profession. It's as simple as that. They also need to be able to trust that this is where you're meant to be, that medicine is actually for you. And if you can't show them that, then they're not ready to put their faith in you and give you a position in medical school. You all know that med school positions are very coveted. And so if you're not showing up and showing, you know what, I've thought about this and I'm ready for this, then they're going to be questioning whether it's a good idea to give you the opportunity. So just a little bit about making sure you say something beyond wanting to help people. So I'm going to go back briefly to what you all said. Sorry, that's the next slide, but I'm just going to go back to the poll. And it was great to see some fantastic responses coming up. So I'd like to share them all again with you. And I know that this is a bit different because you only had so much space to write them and only so much time to write them. But this one up the top, this is awesome. Growing up in a multicultural community, I found there was a lack of representation for my race. So seeing that there's part of this person's story coming in and how this affected their healthcare experience and the way that they accessed healthcare in their community and also how they were treated. And so I would like to provide them with assurance that they have a healthcare professional who understands their traditions and cultures while providing them with high quality care. This is such a good response because it goes, here's the situation and here's the lesson. And the lesson is why I've decided that this is what I want to do with my life. I love being around people and helping people. I can't imagine working in a job where I'm not having an impact on people's lives every day. Being a doctor means that's what you're doing every single day. I love this sentiment. I think that it's really true that you need to have that personality that says, yes, this is the kind of person I am. I care about people. There would need to be something extra in here that shows why it's specifically for you. It doesn't have, just as an FYI, it doesn't have to be a personal experience. You don't have to have had a near-death moment. It's more about what pivotal components or what sort of turning points were there in your life that didn't make you go, you know what, actually not medicine, I'm going to do this instead. And so what times did you have to think about it and really consider, you know what, I'm still going to push forward and want this career? Because it's not an easy one to get into. And I'm sure that none of you would be trying to get in right now if you didn't want to. You would have already found something else. So show why you're still committed to this. Yeah, a lot about I think a few people have made comments about communities that they grew up in. That's a fantastic way to anchor your response and show why you care about supporting those communities, providing healthcare for those. And you can integrate these things into answers for other stations, such as those inequity stations, when and where it's appropriate. Yeah, awesome. I think there was one other, this is a fantastic response as well, how this person talks through, this was my landing point. I grew up with someone or a parent who was a doctor or had a link to the health field, and what lesson this had, or how this empowered others, and how this taught me that I wanted to do that as well. And then it has a little bit about their interests here and the subjects that they gravitated towards, what they were passionate about, and then that they've actually had a bit of volunteering experience and that they've wanted to help empower others. I would even put in here maybe a pivotal experience when they were volunteering, or what's a key lesson that they learned, or maybe a person that they came in contact with that reinforced that they were able to empower them. So thinking about what's the personal touch I have here, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea of how to respond. Great. So just going to switch my screen share back over once more. Sorry. Nope. Are you guys, can I just get a thumbs up that yep, cool. Okay. And so depending on the station, if you do get the YMed station, you might get asked a few other questions. So just have a little bit of an idea of what you might say to questions like this as well. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but they might ask you things like, why not something else? Or why a doctor? Why not allied health? And if you don't think about these first, you can say something that's a little bit silly, or that comes across as the idea of being the best in terms of the doctor hierarchy versus the nurse versus the allied health professional. You definitely don't want to come across as that, I'm sure. So just make sure you have a response to these kinds of questions as well. So if you're not sure how to formulate your response or how to extend it beyond the I want to help people, or you know, I've seen doctors and they were pretty great. These are some things that you can think about as well. So I'm sure everyone has seen a doctor, a dentist, as someone in their life that has impacted their health. If you've gone through your whole life and never gotten sick, then you must be superwoman or superman or superhuman. And so thinking about how did it impact me and my life, whether it was in my community systemically or whether it was me individually or my family. There are lots of people, friends, anyone really, that you are connected to. So after today, I want you all to go home, brainstorm a bit. Why am I trying to get into this ridiculous course? Just as an FYI, if you'd like to back out now, there's the door. You're welcome to back out before this starts. I absolutely love medical school, but it is a huge sacrifice in so many ways. So if you're not prepared for that, probably a good idea to leave now. But I'm sure that's not the case for the majority, if not all of you. So go away, brainstorm, form a cohesive answer and practice it. So what I didn't show you is that actually my answer wasn't just me sharing my life story and going, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. It depended on what way it was phrased to me, the question was phrased to me, and then I would choose components that would be appropriate for me to share and key lessons that would be appropriate to share. So how I mentioned how to practice before to all of you, use this station as one that you can practice. So like I mentioned, it's not about memorizing, okay, so my name is Sarah and the first thing that happened in my life that I remember was this. It's more knowing those key things that you're happy to bring up. So on that note, that is the end of the Why Med segment. If you have questions, if you're confused, if you're not sure if what you're doing is the right thing, you are more than welcome to reach out. Feel free to send me an email. I will put it in the chat as well. We can have a chat about it. Anything that you like, that would be helpful for you. But what I'm going to do now is pass it over to Gabby, and she's going to run you through another station.
Thanks, Sarah. That was awesome. Okay, so hello everyone. Eliza introduced me a little bit at the start, but my name is Gabby, and I'm going to run you through the second station. This station is based on Indigenous health, and I just want to preface this with one, I have a really dodgy microphone, and sometimes it makes like Satan noises. So if that happens, I'm sorry, it may hurt your ears. And second of all, I myself do not identify as an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person. So this is just my perspective. I am most certainly not the most educated person in this area and probably not the best person to be discussing a topic like this. But it is a topic I'm very interested in and passionate about. And we at Halad thought it was really important to run through this station with you all because it is a common topic that comes up and it's also a really important topic. So in saying that, we'll get started. There it is. Okay, so I won't read it out. I'll let you guys read that. And same as before, use that Polar EV link to type in your answers. This is obviously a really complex response and it's hard to put things in, but you can even just do dot points of just like the main, that's a great response, like having one word, that's fine. Just like the main ethical considerations that you would want to touch on. Oh, love that first sentence of that one. Yeah, I would firstly ensure that David feels heard and is involved in his own treatment plan. That's a good one. That's important in every scenario, not just a scenario like this, but yeah, that is a great start. Yeah, so obviously the autonomy of the patient is definitely important here, but also the patient's safety really and their sort of treatment trajectory as well is really important. Yeah, so making sure that the communication is effective and that the information is being conveyed to the patient in a way that they can understand is really important in order to make that informed choice, which is an important part of autonomy. I like this sort of looking at, is it the right treatment here and what are the other options? That's always really good as well. So many responses. Beneficence, yeah, putting in all of, someone's read the aspects of the ethics, what's it called, the ethics principles, whatever.
Yeah, the 4 principles of medical ethics. Definitely
Yeah.
a good one for everyone to know what those 4 are. There we go.
Georgetown
Thanks.
mantra.
Oh, thank you, Tom.
Beautiful.
Great. All right, so there's some great answers, and I'm going to ask Sarah if I can read through them later on because I love hearing people's perspectives. I don't know if she can do that, but I would like that. But do you think we should switch back to the slides? Thank you, everyone, for doing that. I really appreciate it. And I'll just run through a couple of things that I think are really important here. But again, just my opinion, I will definitely miss things and I'm not going to say everything here because I don't want to just reproduce an answer. But these are just sort of the key things that I would want to touch on. I will say when Sarah was saying the different things she used, the different structures you can use to structure your response at the start, I often use the who, what, when, where sort of thing. I found that just really worked for me. But in this scenario, I think the most important thing is just what that student was saying about understanding the patient's concerns and empathizing with them. Obviously, being sick is a vulnerable position, and being sick in a place where you have to travel an extensive amount of time to receive the treatment you need is scary. And, you know, I'm sure all of you could feel that at the moment. So being able to sort of convey that to the patient as well as to the interviewer in this situation is really important. The other aspect here is the Indigenous health aspect and the rural health aspect. So these two things are quite different and I will touch on them in a moment, but both of them do need to be addressed here. And in this situation, it is obviously stated here that the patient's main priorities are his family, and that definitely would be something that I would want to mention, but also the importance of land. So in Indigenous culture, land is actually really important part of this. So touching on that here is definitely relevant in this scenario as well. I will touch on more on that in a moment, but that's something I would definitely want to bring up. Next, patient safety, best treatment. Student brought this up, as well as what other treatment options are available. These are great things to explore, sort of like what if? Is this the best thing for the patient? Is there anything else that can be done instead? And then the other point there is that toll of traveling on individuals and families. I think this is really important because is dialysis really the best treatment if they have to travel so far for it? What toll is that traveling going to do on the patient emotionally? You know, it'd be tiring being away from home. How are they going to feel about that? As well as financially, like they'll obviously have to take time off work. If they're working, the cost of travel, do they have to stay overnight at the place? The social aspect as well. Are they not going to have as much time to, you know, spend time with their work colleagues or their friends? And what toll this has on their physical well-being. So I think this is an important part of that, sort of looking the patient as a whole. And even though, yeah, this dialysis might really help this patient's kidney, is it going to help the patient overall? And I think that's something I would definitely want to discuss here, especially with the man being an Indigenous Australian who obviously finds being with his family a really important part of his life. And the next is what support groups can we call upon to help? I would want to try and find an Aboriginal liaison officer if I could. I think that's an important part of the healthcare team, and the other supports that might help the patient and their family. Maybe there's a financial advising team or someone we can get on board to help with that aspects, maybe some social worker or psychologists as well to sort of help with that aspect. But I know that's a lot of things, and obviously it's hard to touch on everything, and I don't think you have to touch on everything. I think you just have to figure out what you think is the most important things to bring up, and figure out a way to best convey them, because that was always my biggest challenge. Like I had so much to say, but I just couldn't say it in an effective way. So trying to figure that out. Okay, next slide, please, Sarah. So these are the main things. So the topic of Indigenous health often scares people, and they often feel like it is very much a sort of heavy topic. And if you think it is a heavy topic, I want you to sit with that for a moment and sort of ask yourself, why do you think it is a heavy topic for you? Is it because you feel like you don't know enough? You're scared you're going to say the wrong thing? And just sort of realize what those sort of gaps in our knowledge are, I think is really important. So then you can grow, because once you sort of breach that sort of that barrier of uncomfortability is when you sort of get to experience that progression and improvement in areas like this. And there's obviously heaps to know, and you don't have to know everything. You don't have to even know a lot in this area. But I think there is a few things that will be really useful for you to know. The first and most important, I think, is culturally safe terminology. This is big for all cultures, and especially with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander persons. There are some terms that are used that aren't appropriate. So finding out what those are, just to make sure that you aren't using them. The next is just educating yourself on Indigenous Australian culture. They have such a rich culture that is so great and so fun to learn about. So I highly encourage all of you to read up about it. And because we all live in Australia, well, actually some of us might not be in Australia at the moment, but even if you're wanting to come to Australia to study medicine, I think it's important to know about the history a little bit. And it's also really interesting. So having a look, looking that up, we've already touched on the aspect of Indigenous culture, which is that strong connection to the land. So maybe, even Google what land are you on right now, what land were you born on, and find out a little bit more about that. I think that's a great starting point. Next is being up to date with current news. So obviously you don't have to know everything, and at the moment it's a lot of COVID, so it's hard to sift through that. But if there's any huge things going on at the moment, I think it's great to be on top of it. The Black Lives Matter movement, I think, is really important to be sort of aware of that at the moment. Just because it's not only great to sort of be aware of that and maybe bring that up in your interview response, but they may even base a station on it. So that's always good to know. The next is Close the Gap campaign. I think this is something that lots of students look into, but they generally just get sort of like a broad overview and a couple of the priorities, and just sort of use trigger words to explain the campaign. And that's about it. So if you want to distinguish yourself from that, maybe try to look into it a little bit deeper if that's what interests you, to be able find out what parts of it are working, what parts aren't, and why that is, and what other sort of smaller campaigns have stemmed off of this, because I think that'll help you develop more of a sophisticated response to a question that is directly about that, or tying that example into your response as well. The next one is remember that Indigenous health is not the same as rural health. Now, I'll try not to go on a tangent here, but I am a bit tangenty about this topic because so many students mess this up, and it might just be because they just purely don't know, they haven't had that experience, and that's okay. But often it is because sort of there's been this one story told about Indigenous culture, and it is that they live in a rural and remote town all the time. But actually more Indigenous Australians live in metropolitan and regional cities. So it's important to really consider that Indigenous health is its own thing, and so is rural health. They're both really large pillars of health on their own. Yes, there is some overlap sometimes, like in this scenario, there definitely was an overlap of that rural health and Indigenous health, but both aspects need to be touched on individually, and their connections can be touched on as well, but they are two separate things. So making sure you make that distinction, and don't fall into the mistake of, if they bring up Indigenous health, only talking about rural health. You need to talk about Indigenous health. I hope that makes sense. And the last thing is organisations in the space. I think there are so many great organisations in this space that are really cool to look into, to learn more about. And if you know some organisations, they're really good to include in your responses. So for example, Purple House is an organisation that actually provides remote kidney dialysis for patients in the most remote areas in Australia, and they focus on Indigenous health as well. So I think that would be a perfect organisation to bring into something like this. But obviously you're not always going to have a great example, but just being aware of sort of the big players in this space. So other players are like Bridging the Gap Foundation, Fred Hollows Foundation, and the Healing Project. They're all great organisations that you can sort of have a look into. And just the last point I wanted to touch on before I finish off is that this topic is important to know, but not just for interviews. So I think personally that it is important to educate ourselves about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and health, because yes, it may come up in your interview, and it often does. But most importantly, if you want to get into medicine, it is very important that we create a culturally competent and safe healthcare system. I'm definitely not perfect with this, and I definitely don't know everything about these complex topics, and I never will. But it is important to realise those weaknesses that we have in ourselves and those gaps in our knowledge, and do something about it. So like I said at the start, recognise that uncomfortability and push through that. And I think the best way to do that is educate ourselves and become more aware of different cultures and human experiences, which will ultimately help us become better doctors and better people at the end of the day. So don't just do it for interviews. And I think that's it, Sarah.
Awesome. Thank you, Gabby. Okay, so we're getting some claps. Fantastic. So I'll just give you all a little bit of a heads up. I was planning on setting up the breakout rooms very efficiently while Gabby was presenting, but my computer didn't think that was a good idea. So I'll give you all a minute to 2 minutes to just process everything we've gone over. Maybe you can make a list of some things to do after today. So some good reflective practice while I set up these breakout rooms for all of you. And then I'll share with you the scenario that we're going to go over.
Thank you. All right. Well, here's the breakdown. Okay, so in the breakout rooms, you'll have 2 minutes to read the scenarios, 8 minutes to present the answer to the STEM and any questions asked by the tutor, and then 10 minutes of feedback. Okay, so this is the station.
Okay, sorry guys, that was probably more like 5 minutes, but the room should be ready to go for the next 2 now. So I'll just click open and you'll just need to enter it. All right, welcome everyone. So hopefully you've all had a good chance to read the scenario by now. If you feel comfortable, if you can turn on your webcam, and also if you have webcam access, but it's okay if you don't, just makes it a little bit more interactive. So does someone have or is someone feeling brave enough to volunteer to give a response to this station? We're all feeling very excited to do it, I can see. All right, because I know Vera, I'm going to be mean and get her to have a go. But if you guys want to tag team a bit as well, you can. So if anyone's feeling brave enough to then put their hand up. But yeah, there's definitely no right or wrong. And it's so fine if you say something that you're like, wish I hadn't said that. No judgment.
Wait, just quickly, Sarah. So there was the STEM, but what was the question at the end? I'm not sure if I just didn't read that properly or.
Yeah, no, I don't think the question was on the slide, so I'll tell you in a second.
Oh, okay, cool.
Are you guys happy for me to record the station because I've got the host recording, or would you like me to pause the recording?
Yep, I'm good with it.
You're good with it? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So the first question is, discuss the initial ethical considerations in this scenario.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that it's pretty important to consider the fact that there are patients who need to be taken care of that will be deprioritized due to this pandemic. And I think there might be some conflict in deciding who's going to be important enough to receive certain treatments, and certain attention from the healthcare professionals. So there's definitely that. I don't have enough of an answer, so I think I'm going to tag team someone else. That's okay. Do you want me to pick someone, Sarah? I don't really want to call out anyone.
Yeah, so that's all right. And just as an FYI, when you guys do stations, usually or I think most interviews, they'll have questions. So when you finish answering the question, that's fine. They'll just ask you another one. So I'm going to ask you another question. If you're,
Okay.
are you good to keep like rolling through, and I'll ask you some questions?
Sure.
Yeah.
Practice is perfect, right?
Sounds good. That's right. Yeah. Great opportunity to practice here. So should intensive care clinicians try to preemptively select which patients should get admitted so that there is a better outlook on patient admissions?
Well, yeah, that's a really loaded question for sure. I think there are many factors that go into that decision making. And I think it's very important to consider the 4 pillars of the medical ethics when also thinking about which patient is, higher on the list for receiving their treatments in this sort of situation. Sorry, could you repeat the question? I feel like I'm not answering it in full.
Yeah. Should ICU clinicians try to preemptively select the patients which should be admitted to the ICU?
Preemptive. Yeah, so I think before jumping to any conclusions, when it comes to making these sorts of decisions, I need to really look at different things like the patient's medical history, what they've already, what treatments they've already had, what are they currently facing at the moment, all those sorts of factors. So really, really important to look at that because after all, even though we're facing a pandemic during these times, other people's lives are on the line for different reasons, and that shouldn't be overlooked.
Yeah. And what are the ethical issues associated with refusing treatment to patients who are declining in the ICU?
Refusing treatment as in from a healthcare professional refusing the treatment, or okay, right. So obviously when you're, I guess, declining treatment for a patient, there's obviously the possibility that you're putting that patient's life at risk, endangering their life. I'm so blanking right now, Sarah.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
This is good.
Endangering their life. And obviously one of the things that you have to consider as a doctor and always have in the back of your mind is this decision you're making endangering their life? Is there something that you can do to not be in that position? So there's that. That concludes my answer. Sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Great. So I know that you're all probably feeling a little bit shy, but I promise that we're not scary around here. So if anyone would like to pipe up and say something that Vera did well, or if you're feeling shy, you can put it in the chat. Maybe I'll turn off the
taking time to pause and reflect was really good. Like not being afraid of having that short silence. I think it's better to have time to think about what you're going to say before you say it. And I think that shows reflection, which is a good quality.
Oh, thank you. I agree. Reflection's great.
Beautiful.
And you also tried your best to address the question to the best of your ability. I like that you clarified that you understood the question as well. It just, it shows that you're able to say, okay, wait, I need to reconsider some things, and you're brave enough to clarify that. So I think that's also good.
Thanks.
Yeah. Awesome. Anyone else have anything they'd like to add? Okay, now for a slightly trickier one. What advice would you give Vera after today to improve on her answer?
I guess maybe like structure, but I feel like I would have been the same as you. I think you did a good job overall, but I think, like we discussed before in the workshop, just having a structure and making sure that you're kind of sticking to that, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's going to take me some time to actually decide on a structure. And I think for different questions, there are different structure types that are probably better for answering the question. So I agree with your point, Nivi. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Anyone else jumping to give some advice?
I think also like looking at it from different perspectives. So maybe you could have gone like from an ethical perspective as well. So thinking about effects of refusing treatment to vulnerable people who might be low risk. But even still, that's refusing treatments is always bad. So
Yeah. Thanks for that, Kay.
Yeah, thanks so much for being voluntold to do the station, Vera. Really appreciate it. And thanks everyone for contributing some feedback. So let's chat a little bit through this station, and I'm also going to do the same thing. So in terms of things that Vera did really well, I completely agree that taking a moment to reflect, to pause, to think about it. I think also asking for clarification, perfectly fine. You can ask the examiner, do you mean this? Often they'll have questions that seem a bit ambiguous. It's perfectly fine for you to go, wait, can you just repeat that part again? Or what part did you want me to address? So they're not expecting you to perfectly read their mind. So I thought that was really nicely done. Vera also has this very warm, friendly approach. And so I wouldn't change that. Yeah. So, and I mean, I have the advantage of like knowing Vera a little bit, but Vera does have this very warm, friendly approach. So bring yourself to it. And I think that she did that really well.
Thanks, Sarah.
Also, yeah, absolutely. And also something that was really good was remembering that this scenario was written in the context of the pandemic and bringing that back into her response. So utilizing the parts of the STEM that are really guiding these questions. So in case, I think you probably all would have noticed that the questions were, okay, now let's go broader. So let's talk about intensive care resource allocation. Let's talk about who we should admit. And it started to ignore the actual STEM itself, but she brought the STEM back in. So if you're feeling like you're struggling a bit with it, you can always refer back to the core STEM or to the core scenario and go, how would I apply this to this scenario? Or how can this help me in this scenario to help ground you a bit, especially if you're like, I'm not too familiar with this. You're also always welcome to say, I'm not too familiar with this, or I've never really heard of this before. Completely fine. And they're not expecting that you're going to be overly comfortable with topics like this. You've never been a medical professional before, or most of you haven't. Some people might have done something else before deciding to do medicine, but most of you won't have a lot of exposure to it. So they're not expecting you to know all of the nitty-gritty ins and outs of how it works. It's more asking, how do you think about these kinds of situations? Yeah, cool. So let's move on a little bit to some feedback or some things that we can do to improve. I'm going to make some of this specific to Vera, but also some of it more general to all of you. So the first thing is when you get asked the question, I really like that you took a moment to think about the question. So let's talk about the first one, discuss the initial ethical considerations present in this scenario. So what I would make a little clearer is that structure when you go in and go, okay, so you've asked me about the ethical considerations. What are some ethical, like sort of sticking points that are going on here? So in this case, the scenario was about the ICUs filling up. And so the main concern here, or if you remember back to my myriad of lots and lots of things that I went over in the workshop, and I definitely recommend after this, everyone sort of reflecting on which parts were most beneficial for you. But one of the things is when you read the STEM, what do I think about this? And how does this, or what connection do I have this? What do I know about this? And so in this scenario, the ICU is filling up, and I don't know a lot about how ICUs work. I don't know a lot about what they actually do when it's filling up. But what I do know is that it's a problem when people who are sick can't get the healthcare that they need. So they can't get beds or they can't get treatment. And so that's something I do know and I am familiar with. And then what do I think about this? I think that this is a really worrying, this is very concerning, because then people who are sick are missing out on what they need. So then I've sort of like grounded myself to the scenario before I even go in and get a question. And so then the question goes, what are the ethical considerations in this scenario? I go, okay, cool. So the beds are filling up. What things would I have to think about to work out what I should do next? And so things I have to think about are things like justice. things like fairness. Is there a way to fairly say patient X should get treatment over patient Y? Is there a way to show why someone should be more appropriately suited to treatment over someone else, just based on things that have nothing to do with their healthcare, such as how old they are or how many kids they have? So a good approach you could take is something like utilitarianism, where you say, you know what, I think that it's about the greatest good for the greatest number. Or maybe you take something like non-maleficence and say, you know what, I don't want anyone getting hurt unnecessarily. So if we can prevent people from getting hurt, then that would be a good starting point. And then you can start providing your thinking and go, you know what, I don't really know how that could work, but maybe it could work by opening more beds, or maybe it could work by turning some wards into an ICU. And you can just say, I don't really know how a healthcare system works, but I do believe that when people are sick, we should do the best we can. Or maybe it would work by getting allied health professionals to go and provide support outside of hospital. So you can come up with different sort of solutions or conclusions, even if you have absolutely no idea how it actually works. They're not looking for you to provide a commentary on how the healthcare system actually works. So you're definitely welcome to utilize structure to benefit your answer. And so when you get asked the question, think about how will I structure sort of my ideas around this? And you can choose what structure works for you. So if it's point A, B, C, or if it's if this, then this. So pick something that helps you feel like you can organically give your thoughts. Yeah. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was actually really great, Sarah. Thank you.
Awesome. That's all right. Do you have any questions at this point? Any questions about that?
Oh, wait, actually, I do. Yeah, so one of the points that you made during the talk was, I guess, not being on the fence, making decisions, like making a clear-cut decision. But obviously, this is one of those scenarios where there are just so many uncontrollable factors and things that you have to consider before just jumping the gun and making a straight, clear-cut decision. For this kind of question, would you kind of prefer like a decision being made in the answer? Or is it more like gauging and actually expressing what kind of things are you gauging when responding?
Yeah. So in terms of a question like, and that's great, because now what I'd like to do for the rest of this little breakout room is go over each of the questions in this scenario more generally and let you guys know some of the things that I would go away and think about, or some of the different ways you can or different things you can consider when structuring your response. So for that first question, discuss the ethical considerations. No need for you to make a decision. A lot of the opening questions, they won't get you to make any sort of decision or give an overarching opinion. It will be, what sort of things are you thinking about? So they want to see, how's your brain working at the moment? What are you thinking through? And so with this question, discuss the initial ethical considerations. You can go bang, 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 here are 3 considerations, or you can use one of those structures to explain considerations. So no need to make one there. With this second question, should intensive care clinicians try to preemptively select their patients? This one, they would be expecting either A, a definitive decision, or B, something that would be like, if I was in this context, or if I had this knowledge, then I would make X decision. So they'd want to see how you would make the decision. If you decide to sit on the fence, which I don't love, but if you decide to, then it would need to be very reassuring that in the scenario, you would know how to come to a conclusion, because this scenario really is about the need to make a decision so that the ICU can provide support to people in a way that they think is best. And so if you're in the shoes of making that decision, what are you going to choose? But they don't really care what you choose. So I don't want anyone thinking, I chose the wrong thing. It's about why you chose it. So they're saying, are you thinking in a way that shows that you chose it for a good reason? And it's fine if you don't choose what they would actually have chosen in a hospital. So fine. It's more about, were you being a dickhead about it? Or were you thinking through it in the way that they would want a healthcare professional to think through it? So in terms of that question, should they preemptively select patients? The main issue here is that it's basically saying, before someone walks through the door, or before we give someone a bed, rather than just going, you know what, this person's really sick, they should get a bed, looking at them and going, you know what, patient A can get the bed over patient B because of factors X, Y, Z. So maybe it's patient A is younger, so they have more chance of recovery and they have a better life ahead of them than the patient who's middle-aged or elderly. And so it's going, okay, they get it. And so that's, you could even show the scenario and go, you know what, I could see this scenario happening if two people had the same condition and one of them was young and one of them was older, and saying that the younger person should get it. However, I think that it's not fair to just say why a patient should get something before even discussing it with the patient. So before I made a decision about where the patient goes, I need to talk to them first and ask them what their wishes are, because maybe one of the patients doesn't even want intensive care. So then you're showing, you know what, I'm not comfortable to fully jump in and say yes or no, but here's how I would go forward with this. In terms of that, you can bring in lots of other things that you might know about. For example, I could also say, well, I'm aware of paternalistic models of medicine, which is when the doctors essentially gets to decide for the patients what happens to them. And I don't really think that this is a fair way to practice medicine, because medicine is about the individual who's sick. So instead, we need to be talking to the person who's sick and asking them what they want. And if they're unable to tell us, then it's asking the person there who is able to tell us, because they care about their loved one far more than we'll ever care about them. So bringing in principles that you're like, this applies to this person or this applies to this scenario, that can help me make that choice. So those are the things that I would put in when you get a question like should, or what should we do, or what would you do? If you're not sure what you would do, you can bring in, if this was the scenario or if this was the principle, then this. So you could also apply this one to the COVID-19 scenario that's in this STEM, and say something like, you know what, we know that from COVID-19, more elderly people died than younger people with it. So instead of just saying, you know what, the younger person gets the bed, first I would like to talk to both parties and see, you know, what are their wishes for the healthcare? Have they been in ICU before? Do they have any comorbidities? And make the discussion more about them and less about me and just my knowledge. So then you've made this synthesized answer that considers the STEM and considers the ethics. And that was just my example. That doesn't mean you go away and memorize my example and go, this is the right answer. You can think of it whatever angle you prefer. Yeah. Any questions about that one? Cool.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In terms of the first question on the station about ethical considerations,
yeah,
could it be quite general and abstract? Like, for example, you talked about the shortages and the beds and all that, but if I was to go along the pathway of the impacts on the patient and their family maybe, and like the broader social implications, would that still be okay? Or do they want a specific pathway from the applicant talking about like the shortages and the healthcare system?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that is exactly the point of bringing yourself to the interview. You, unless they specifically say, please tell me about the ethical considerations around choosing a bed for someone, you can choose, you have flexibility of the angle you take to address the question and address the scenario. So definitely, if you're more inclined to talk about the impact on the patient and their family and how this links in ethically, perfectly fine. So please bring yourself, bring your thoughts, your ideas, your opinions to the scenario, and use that to springboard off of the question that you're asked. So definitely you can bring your own ideas. The main thing with that, I would say, is super helpful to find out about are the key ethical principles involved in medicine. So that was another great thing Vera did, was she mentioned that there are ethical principles. You don't have to discuss them all. You can pick one or two. So those principles are beneficence, which is just a fancy word for helping the patient or for doing good. Non-maleficence, so not doing harm. Autonomy, or respect for autonomy. So that's more what I was talking about there, about talk to the patient and listen to what they want. And the last one is justice. So is this fair? So fairness versus unfairness. So knowing those four, even though you don't have to go, here are the 4 principles I'm going to tell you now, you can use them to help your thinking, because those are the 4 principles we use all the time in ethical discussions in medicine. So even if you're subtle about it, you can go, you know what, I want to talk about whether this is just, or I want to talk about whether this is harming anyone. Which one of you mentioned in the feedback that you gave about whether we should withdraw treatment. And you mentioned that that is harming someone and that we shouldn't be harming someone. So that is exactly relying on that principle of non-maleficence, or not causing harm. And so already you're using that principle to your advantage. That's definitely a buzzword that you can use, but you definitely don't have to say it. And there's no need to sound like a robot of, I've learned the 4 principles and now I'm going to say them. You can use them to guide your answers. In terms of that final question, what are the ethical issues with withdrawing treatment for worsening patients in the ICU? You can bring up things like, you know what, there is non-maleficence, which is not harming someone, but I also have to balance it with effectively helping people. And, you know, if there are no beds left and someone's unfortunately inevitably going to die, then maybe it would be better to let them die comfortably at home and give the bed to someone else who's much more likely to recover. The reason why I wanted to give you guys that example is because it sounds like a bit of a controversial opinion. If I'd said it more brashly, I would have said, send them home and let someone else have it and they can die at home. That's obviously an awful thing to say. I think you all know why. But if you do have that kind of opinion, that's fine. It's about how you say it, and you're still using ethical principles. So if you think something that's a little bit controversial but still uses those principles, you're still welcome to share it. You're still welcome to say it. Just practice at home saying it in a tactful way, and a way that actually helps show that you're thinking through things really logically. Okay, so just to finish up, does anyone have any final questions about this station or just about medical ethics in general?
I have a question about just answering questions and what they're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So, like you said, there's no real correct answer for a lot of the stations. So how do they like mark you? I guess is my question, because is it based on how genuine you are? Or?
Yeah, yep. So they're marking you on a couple of things. One of the things they're marking you on is definitely your genuinity, and if you're showing those skills of being emotive, of being empathetic, of understanding the scenario. They're also marking you on your structure, and not so much where you're able to give this perfectly polished structure, but more if your thoughts were scattered all over the place, as opposed to where you're able to think through it under pressure, because it really shows how are you able to sort of work under pressure and work when you're given a lot of information to synthesize. So that is something they think they mark you on. And they also mark you on, did you consider fairly a few angles or enough angles? So did you just hard and fast choose a response and go, this is my answer? Or did you consider enough principles? So they're not so much marking you on tick, you're correct, as opposed to synthesizing all the different elements that take place when you provide your answer. So unfortunately, it's not as clear cut as like, okay, I got 8 out of 10 because I gave 4 out of 5 points correctly. It's more about synthesizing all of the components that make a difference in giving a good answer.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, it's all right. And I would also say to that, if you're not sure, like if there are parts that you're like, I'm not sure if this matters or not, tons of stuff online that you can look up. Probably steer away from less reputable sources such as Reddit, but I would find things that can sort of guide you to say, you know what, they would be looking at this kind of thing in this kind of station. Yeah. So it looks like everyone's back. So hopefully it was helpful to run through that station. You got a bit of advice and some pointers. So what I'm going to do is move on to station number 2 for you guys to do in the breakout room. Just share this screen. So have a read of the scenario again, and then when you go to the room, same as before, you'll get given some questions. All right, and you should be able to enter your breakout rooms now. So is there anyone who feels like volunteering to do this station? All right.
I'll do it.
Yay. Thanks, Ting. All right.
No worries.
So your question for this is, how would you respond to this situation?
So one of the things that, we often think about when we hear a person is not pulling their weight is to think that they're slacking. But I think it's not appropriate to jump to any assumptions. I would approach that workmate personally and just have a conversation about if there is anything in their personal life that they're having troubles with or that they need help with, and invite them to talk about it if they are willing to. This allows me to understand and engage what is happening that in their personal life or outside of work that is causing them not to contribute to the project. Yeah.
No, perfect. Yep. And what would you do if so you've spoken to them and your initial response was unsuccessful?
In this case, if we've spoken to them, and because this project has a deadline in 2 weeks, so I would escalate this to perhaps the manager that is in charge of this project and speak to the manager, but not in a way where we're saying, oh, this person is not contributing, but perhaps in a way that you're concerned about them. So you could be like, this person in our group hasn't been responding. I'm just worried that there is something in their life or in other aspect of work that is causing them trouble or causing them stress that they're unable to contribute to this project specifically. And I was wondering if you would be able to speak to them to see what's going on, because I haven't been able to get into contact with them.
Yeah, okay. And let's say that you contact them again and you have this chat with them and they tell you that someone really close to them has recently gotten very sick. What would you do next?
So I would offer, my condolences, and also be there to listen to them if they're willing to talk about it. Just knowing that there is someone there, even at work, that is able to provide them support. I think that would reassure them, and also build trust between the colleague, and also perhaps seek out services or support services that might be able to help them, like a mental health service if they're going through really tough times. Yeah, I think that's all I've got.
Yeah. And have you ever come across a challenge yourself in a teamwork situation, and how did you overcome that?
Well, as a uni student, I've been through 4 years of uni, and inevitably we would have come across some teamwork challenges, but I think the one key thing in teamwork is communication. I would say that could you repeat the question again?
Yeah. Have you ever come across a challenge in a teamwork situation, and how did you overcome it?
Yeah, so, being in a uni group, being in as a uni student, having gone through many group projects, there has been situations where people have not responded. However, I feel like communication was one of the big things that was able to pull my group project together. using the methods I've spoken about before, trying to reach out to the person, has really helped them to understand my concerns for them, and also they feel that they are being supported, and yeah.
Yeah. All right. Great. So I'm going to give you all a moment to, I want at least one of you to give Ting a little bit of feedback. What's something that she did well?
So I'm gonna, sorry, I was just like in bed before. I'm still in bed.
Yeah, I'm in my robe, that's why I'm not showing my video.
No, I know. Maybe I should stop video then. Okay, I'll stop.
I'll pause the recording, hang on. So I've just restarted the recording, and just for context, I paused it for a bit while we had a discussion. So nice to see all your faces, all the camera on now. So something just really quickly to close up with that we were chatting about in our room was just two really quick things. The person mentioned, you know what, this is the first time I've done this, and I just want you all to keep in mind that this is like ground zero, like day one for most, if not all of you. So hopefully it was a nice exposure, a nice taster for you, and that you can go from here today. And so there's no need to feel this immense pressure that you should have done something perfectly. In fact, I don't really believe in doing anything perfectly, but no need to feel like you're ready to attempt MMIs full force right now. With that in mind, something that a lot of my students do in my GAMSAT classes is that they contact each other. I think they use the chat function through class sometimes, I don't even know they're doing it, and ask each other if they can practice things together. So they'll share essays together or whatnot. So if you feel like you don't have anyone to practice with, feel free to message someone who is in your breakout room, message them in the chat right now and be like, hey, do you want to meet up on Zoom and practice some scenarios? And you can create some scenarios for each other. So opportunity is there for you to find someone to buddy up with. If you don't know someone or you're shy, you can message me. I can tee you up with someone who also needs a buddy, and we can help you to feel supported and feel like you can get some practice in. So that would be my recommendation from today, is go away and practice some scenarios, and feel free to make mistakes and give each other feedback and get some practice in with the principles we've gone over today. So hopefully going over that was helpful for you. What I'd like you all to do now is to type something in the chat that you've learned, or I'm going to add to that as well a goal that you're going to make, so something you're going to do after today. So if you can all type that in the chat, and also if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat or feel free to email. And on that note, thank you so much for coming along. I'm going to hand it back over to Eliza.
So just what's next from here? As you can see, the first link that I've just dropped is we have recently just decided that we're actually going to do this whole thing again. So we're going to do another Master Skills Workshop 2.0 with different scenarios, so that really you guys can come back in a month's time and think about those ways that you've communicated today and really put them into practice and improve and see how much you've come in a month's time. So I'd love to see you guys back at Master Skills 2.0 on the 22nd of August. If you have not registered already, I believe I have just opened the tickets, as you guys were talking about before. So the link is in the first one below. The second thing that's sort of coming up is if you have not already, please join our Facebook community through this new Facebook page, Halad to Health Australia. This is where we post a ton of all our free resources, and especially all the resources that are going towards this MMI and men interview time. One of which is really exciting, is the launch of our podcast next week called Making of an Incredible MD, which you can now stream on Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well as YouTube. First episode has not gone up yet, but it will be live next Wednesday. And basically what we want to do from there is give you guys a really accessible, quick way of learning different, not quite learning, but being able to see different people's perspectives on health issues across society, just so that you guys can see more of a varied opinion. So every week we interview an MD student, and then we interview a current physician, and have them talk you through their way of thinking, to hopefully get, in a month's time, for you to be able to formulate a really solid opinion for yourself, just by having a variety of access to different people through that podcast. So they'll have weekly episodes on that. which is amazing. But also if you're starting to get serious about your MMI practice and you're really gunning to have an interview offer this semester break, then our actual mock MMI rounds, which are the pretty much the intense thing for these med interview preps, starts on 5th of September and they'll end on the 4th of October. And essentially for each round, you'll have an 8-station circuit which lasts for 2 hours. So you have 2 minutes of reading time, 8 minutes of response time, and then a swap over to the next station. You'll have 8 rounds. Then after that weekend, you'll have an hour and a half's cohort review where essentially you get de-identified and you get ranked on each station, and you'll be able to see just how the best responses to each station were articulated. So hopefully you guys can learn from each other's responses. And that is made super affordable at $149 per circuit for about 3.5 hours. It is like, if you want to enroll early, I highly suggest you do, because we genuinely do have limited spots. As you can imagine, we can only have 8 students per MMI round, but it is fully refundable if you want to enroll early now and if you end up missing out on an offer down the line. Also, if you are going to do that, I highly suggest holler at a friend, like find a friend, because we always do this. We have a 10% off discount whenever you sign up with a friend. So like Sarah said, maybe right now I'd suggest pause this, find someone in the chat, ask them if they want to do it, and you guys can message Carleen and get a 10% discount off together. And I guess the last link that I've left below is that to check out our interactive calendar for all of our upcoming events. We update this all the time so you guys can see what's going on, and it's essentially tells you all the things that we have live so you don't miss them. A new thing that we've just put in recently has been this event called Doctors with Side Hustles. And it's essentially, again, another great event for you guys to attend in 2 weeks' time to really open your eyes to different perspectives of practicing physicians and sort of how they can make impact through their profession, but also beyond that as well, and how they've converted that into their really impactful companies that they have currently built. So I hope you guys are all excited for all those upcoming things. I know it's a lot, but I suggest you just save those links for yourself for whenever you're ready to be able to deep dive into a bit more content for these mid-interview preps, as well as doing some live prep as well. But with that, I will close off today and again say thank you to all of our examiners who have come along, and thank you to all of our students who've also come along and supported us through this. Hope you have a terrific weekend and I'll see you soon.
Thanks so much, guys. Have a good weekend.